Hey everybody, do you want to hear some awesome news? With each passing day, we're drawing closer to a world without extreme poverty. And as this happens, so too are we drawing closer to a world without war. This is great news indeed. The main reason that an end in poverty also means an end in war is because the two are so deeply intertwined. Critics of the so-called war on terror often state how the best solution to addressing the threat of terrorism is to deal with the underlying conditions of poverty, because they say poverty is terror, meaning the suffering and pain endured by those who live under the dire conditions of extreme poverty are synonymous with living in a life of terror. Drawing on the same analogy, we can also say that poverty is war, in that living in poverty is a root grievance that leads most people to take up arms. So as we eliminate extreme poverty, we will be much closer to being able to make world peace a reality. Now, as we talk about poverty, it's important to note the different kinds of poverty that we have in our world. There are three generally accepted types of poverty. There's relative, moderate, and extreme. Relative poverty refers to the poorest people living in developed nations. Their basic needs are usually met, but they are still poor relative to the rest of the population. People who live in relative poverty, like welfare recipients, homeless people, and single mothers, to name a few, they most often never got the same opportunities in life that others have had. While it is true that some of these people are in fact just plain lazy and they squandering their lives and making poor choices, most of the people who live in relative poverty come from poor, often abusive homes, and many suffer from drug addiction problems and/or mental health issues. However, it is important for us to make a mental distinction between the poor that those of us who live in developed nations see on the city streets around us and the moderate and extreme poor who live in our world. Often people confuse relative poverty with the more severe kinds of poverty, and they group them all into the same category when in fact they are widely different. This is why it is so important for us to note the different forms of poverty. Moderate poverty is defined as living on less than $2 a day, and about 1.6 billion people live in moderate poverty. The definition for extreme poverty is living on less than $1 a day. Now, could you imagine living on less than $400 a year? This wouldn't be easy to do anywhere in the world, but to the 1.1 billion people who live in extreme poverty, this is all that they've ever known. Life in extreme poverty is a struggle just to stay alive. Every single day, 17,000 people, mostly children, fail to meet that struggle and they starve to death. And millions more die every year from easily preventable diseases. These people who live and die in extreme poverty, they're not lazy and they're not stupid. Most often they are industrious and resourceful people who work very long hours every day performing complex tasks. The problem is that their income level is so low that they have no opportunities to escape from their circumstances. The money that they make barely keeps them alive, and that's all. Their only options are to work or to die. And without an opportunity to rise out of the economic trap, people who live in extreme poverty are essentially enslaved to the system in which they live. To see what life is like in extreme poverty, we can look at the life of an 8-year-old Guatemalan boy named Cesar. Cesar's home is a dump, literally. He spends his days with his family, rummaging through a garbage landfill looking for scraps of plastic or paper to recycle, things that can be salvaged for resale, and even food to eat. At night, he and his family sleep on a shack built right on the waste pile after struggling all day for just a few cents. Cesar and his family suffer from skin and lung diseases, and with no education and no real way to improve their conditions, they have little hope to get out of this situation. Cesar and his siblings are condemned to this life of extreme poverty, or at least they would be until their situation gets improved by external forces. And in the next video we'll talk more in detail about what these forces are. Cesar's story is heartbreaking, but it is just one of more than a billion similar stories being played out all around the world. This is what about 1 in 6 people go through every single day. So as we look at these people who grow up in such absolutely despondent conditions, it can be easy to see how they could fall into less than favorable roles in life. Criminal organizations have a nearly unlimited supply of new recruits looking for something more than life on a garbage heap. Militias and extremist organizations, they can find their foot soldiers amongst those who've been left behind by the world. So as we reduce the levels of poverty in our world, so too will we be reducing the negative consequences of having humans live under such conditions. Of course, we don't have to just suppose about whether or not living in poverty really corresponds to war. We can also look at some facts. Researchers have found that there exists a strong correlation between the absence of well-being and the prospects for violence. As well, while radical violent groups are often led by educated people of means, these groups are found to have exploited the conditions of poverty to expand the political appeal of their cause and recruit their foot soldiers. Even in developed nations, relative poverty contributes to war. The author of the book Working Class War claims that 80% of the enlisted men for the Vietnam War came from poor or working class families. Similarly, in 2004, nearly two-thirds of U.S. Army recruits came from counties in which the median household income was below the U.S. average. It's just like the French writer Jean-Paul Sartre says, "When the rich wage war, it's the poor who die." Another stark example of how poverty can lead to war happened in Germany after the First World War. Suffering under the vindictive and unworkable Versailles Treaty, the Germans, along with having to pay huge war reparations, received further economic blows by being stripped of valuable land, resources, and other major sources of income. Owing more in reparations than they could earn, the Germans ended up with their currency going into hyperinflation and their country went bankrupt. The economic mess and the corresponding feelings of resentment, desperation, and hopelessness, these laid the foundation for the rise of Hitler and fascism, and as history shows us, this led to a bloody global conflict and the loss of millions of lives. So, just to reiterate the point of this video, in case you missed it, it's that poverty and war walk hand in hand. And as we get rid of poverty, we will be in a much better position to get rid of war. As already mentioned, the next video will look at what we can and will be doing to address the issue of poverty around the world. For now, know that poverty has been on the decline for decades, and within 10 to 20 years we will have eliminated extreme poverty and our entire world will be in a much better place. Thank you very much for watching these videos, and be sure to stay tuned to get more rational reasons to be hopeful and optimistic about the future. Stay positive.